This episode of Planted is brought to you by Pax Labs.
The Radio Misfits Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Planted with Sara Pine. I'm Sara Pine, your host, and today I am thrilled to be here at the California State Fair recording. California didn't just participate in cannabis history. It helped define it. The patients, the advocates, the cultivators, the researchers, the entrepreneurs. And today, we're celebrating excellence through the California Cannabis Awards. But awards, they recognize a moment. Legacy is something we build over time. So the question I'd like us to explore today is, what does California owe the future of cannabis? Joining me are two friends and colleagues who bring distinct but complementary perspectives to this conversation. Laura Fogelman is the Chief of Staff and Vice President of Communications at PAX, and Ishaq Ali is Researcher and Program Director at ECCO. Laura, Ishaq, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited about our conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. So I want to kick off this conversation with our roots. Like, what do you think that California has done right? Because we have, when we look at like access, we had the first medical program. We may not have been the first legalization, though we should have been, but we did build the foundation that everybody else has built from or riffed off. Well, what do you think that we've done right?
All right. Well, I can kick this one off. I think California cannabis has really created the foundation for and shaped the industry. And I think it's, not dissimilar for how the state has pioneered so much innovation, whether it's related to, tech or agriculture or so many of the other things that, California is really the birthplace of. But I believe through and through that the cannabis industry would not be what it is today had it not been for California really paving the way through 215, through just all of the, evolution and advocacy and the movement that so many spent years tirelessly fighting for. I think it really built the foundation for everything that we have today.
Yeah, and I think of California as kind of like the hub of cannabis culture. Like, it's been here for honestly over 100 years. It's a very deeply ingrained culture in farmers, in patients, in just all over the state. And so I think California has been able to cultivate a very deeply ingrained culture, a deep relationship with the plant, farmers with the plant and the patients. And so I feel like it's developed this very, very powerful network. And I think we have a very big spotlight on us. And I think we have the opportunity to be able to show what we've built over, 80 plus years in this last 10 years of legalization. And when I think of like one of the most important pieces that we have brought forward is, the idea that cannabis is medicine, and that 20 years or 30 years ago now.
That's where it started. Yeah,
exactly. That's how it started. And like 30 years ago, when cannabis was first legalized, we were able to really set ourselves apart by pushing forward the narrative of compassion and care. And I think when I think of California culture, I think of compassionate care when it comes to cannabis.
Yeah. When I go into other states and do policy work, that's one thing that people would always ask, especially like with the compassion programs we have. I feel like we could do more with those, but I feel like there's a lot of activists who are really working hard to try to keep the heart of that. Administratively, I feel like there are things that we need to do to demystify and simplify it for people who would want to participate, but feel kind of daunted by the era of legalization and tracking and all of that. But when we talk about that in places outside of California, people ask, why can't we have that here? Because, most of the policies have started out being patient focused. And as we know, it's incredibly expensive to be critically or chronically ill, much less paying out of pocket for medicine. And I feel like we're kind of turning back to looking at it through a wellness and medicinal lens as things grow and as individuals start to have their aha moments about how it can help them through different things or a loved one. But, one of the things that really brought that conversation up into the forefront were some of the people who directly influenced 215 coming to be and, nurtured it throughout before we got into legalization. Was there a person or a moment that shaped the way you think about cannabis?
I mean, I think for me, it really was that whole generation of people. Not a single person, but it was the Dennis Perones, the John Entwistles, the Wayne Justmans, the Dale Geringers sitting around the table at the Castro Castle. But it's really interesting to kind of see the full circle moment, because not only did they lead the movement, 30 years ago, but I recently spent some time in DC. Observing some of the DEA hearings. And there's a big conversation right now about the currently accepted medical use of cannabis. And there would be no way to demonstrate any of that were it not for these medical programs that have existed for decades now. And so we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and the work that they did then not only created the moment that we're in, but I think paved the way for the next 30 years.
Yeah. And I mean, I grew up in like a Muslim family that wasn't very privy or positive towards cannabis, drugs in general, quote unquote drugs. But over time, like when you see a medical system that is broken, that has been, a part that's many people in our family have experienced, and really started seeing cannabis as a way to take back control of your own body, and like being able to say, this is the medicine that I want. My mother, who passed away 13 years ago, was not a fan of cannabis, but dealt with a lot of different cancer treatments that were very harsh on the body. And it was through that experience and that observation of experiencing that alongside my mom that I realized that cannabis is this medicine that can be extremely helpful for people, a lot less harmful than things that are, prescribed to people. And so it was always really important for me that when I entered this industry, as it legalized when I graduated college, that like I wanted to make sure that anyone who uses this medicine, it is the cleanest thing possible. And so I agree with Laura when it's like we stand on the shoulders of giants who helped us destigmatize it, who dealt with, a government that wasn't a fan of their movement. And they continued to push it forward. They're still here at the state fair. Normal has a booth at the state fair continuing this fight. And so when I think about like who influenced, it was this infrastructure of advocates who helped me build the narrative to then talk to my family and friends about it. And so we have to recognize that there are people that have really fought for this over decades and decades.
Yeah, 100%. I know there's so many people who I am grateful for and look up to. One person I think about in particular today that I'm missing is Terrence Allen. Terrence was my colleague, my co-chair on the legalization task force. And I wish he could be here today to really see, even in the short amount of time that he's been gone, he's been so missed. But there has been a lot of change since he left us. And I also think that it's incredibly important. Every year around Pride, I usually put something out. I like to talk about it all the time because I think Pride is every day. But the inherent queerness of cannabis, especially cutting my teeth in the Castro, and, such an amazing community, and so many of the people who were very impactful during the AIDS crisis are still in the Castros, wonderful that they're here to be able to share the rich history, like, meeting Cleve Jones and, Ken Jones before he passed, and just really talking about the fact of how they had to go and do things that were risky to be able to get cannabis for the people that they loved who were sick. And I think, I always feel like every time I put that up on LinkedIn, somebody's like, what are you talking about? The inherent queerness of cannabis. And I'm like, okay, buddy, let's sit down and talk about this. Let's unpack this, because this isn't about, I know we're looking at a time now where we're looking at the bottom line. We're looking at numbers. We're looking at, all these other things, but it began with people who were trying to save people that they loved. And I think that's like one of the most important things.
And I think that's a core piece of the culture. That's like the beauty of it, right? It's not just like people that are out here trying to get high or be stoners or sell weed. It's like that's part of like the beauty of what people are putting into the plant and then sharing with folks.
Yeah. And on that note, what values from the early days do you see that are worth protecting?
I mean, I think for me, the theme that continues to, permeate the moment that we're in today is really this idea that, we're in the nascent phase of this and we're part of a movement and the work is not done. And, certainly we all have our businesses and our bottom lines and our kind of commercial interests to advance, but we will have no opportunity to do that if the infrastructure isn't solid across the program. And so I think, every day waking up and showing up and continuing to fight for even incremental progress and changes. I am involved with some of the industry associations here in the state, and every session, we need to be working to advance things that make the program better. And it can't just be, fighting against tax increases. That's just so important. But like, we actually have to look at what isn't working well from a root cause perspective and be willing to continue to fight those fights, because this is precarious and, people are facing a lot of really significant challenges that dictate whether they can continue to operate in California or not. And so I think, making sure that certainly the patient stays at the center of the conversation, but that we're constantly fighting to make things better and improve the program is going to be really important going into the next chapter.
Yeah.
I also think like just existing in a time where we're watching a lot of systems break down around us. I honestly think of this as like an opportunity to build something new and a new way of doing business in general. I think a lot of people have become very jaded with how businesses operate these days. And a lot of people in the cannabis industry who've been doing it for like, 10 plus years are very jaded. But like when I think about the future of cannabis, I think about, there's a lot of like incremental change, small changes that we can make, but this is also a place where we can be bold. I mean, like when we think about in 1996, people that were trying to legalize cannabis, which people saw as a capital D, like bad drug, and they got it passed through compassionate care. And so like, I feel like it gives us this opportunity to also be very creative about how we do business. And I think one of the most important things is making sure that we're continuing to center, the growers and patients and people, really the people more than just the business. And I know it's easier said than done when we're, existing in a place in a time where we need to be making money. But at the same time, I also think that it is time to try something new, because people have been doing the same thing for so long in so many different sectors, and it's all falling apart anyway. So it's like we don't have to abide by like these old rules and old ways of thinking, and go back to thinking about like plant-centered, people-centered business.
But, it's funny because in some ways I think that it is a different way of thinking. But in some ways I think we're going back to some traditional values too, because, especially like in the 215 days, we had, every business gave back. They contributed in some way, where there's a compassion program where I know like, where I started out, we used to give a lot to the community. Like there had been a school, an elementary school that had been broken into and robbed. And we actually went there and like built a playhouse and helped contribute to get everything ready for when the kids came back to school. And it's that conversation. I was just having this with Ben Cohen the other day about conscious capitalism. Like, in a day and age where a lot of like CEOs of companies are making 20 times plus what their employees are making, there's a huge disconnect. When we support businesses that support their communities, there's an amazing thing that happens. People are invested in their work. They're locally employed. The money is going into these communities. Like when we go up to like Humboldt and Mendocino back in the 215 days, you definitely saw a lot of what happened when the money was actually staying in the communities to support them. And I feel like, that's kind of how we used to be before we had so many large businesses. We had there's always going to be a place for large companies. That being said, there's something to be said about localizing businesses and really supporting small mom and pops that bring, that are part of their communities, that are active, that participate. I know like one of the ways that we've changed how people look at, cannabis and cannabis culture and cannabis policy is the fact that at least here in the Bay Area, a lot of the dispensaries went into areas that were considered blighted because of green zones and different things like that. But what we really saw was that they actually helped beautify the communities and make those blocks safe and really contributed to that. And I think that just like what we saw in like the mid 90s with the tech industry and how that changed the way we went to work. We don't have to go to work in like 3-piece suits anymore, and it's not so formal, and people can actually be closer to their authentic selves and be creative and do work and participate. And that's carried on into other cultures and other work cultures. I feel like cannabis, we can do that too, where we look at like, large companies are looking at what they can do to help their communities and support their communities. Smaller businesses can contribute more, and we can really look at like as an ecosystem what that looks like when, whether big or small, the people who are working in the industry really care about what's going on and making the world a better place and understanding the gravity of their position in our communities. Still smoking joints? Okay, we need to talk. If you love cannabis but you're still lighting it, let's look at what's actually happening. When you burn flower, you're creating smoke, and that smoke contains harmful compounds like tar, soot, benzene, and formaldehyde. In fact, almost 200 different compounds have been detected in joint smoke. So how do we know this? PAX decided to study it. In controlled lab testing, they compared joint smoke to vapor from their devices, using the same flower under the same conditions, and measured 16 key harmful compounds. The result is pretty striking. Vaporization reduced those compounds by more than 95%, because when you heat cannabis instead of burning it, you change what you inhale. You still get cannabinoids and flavor, just without all the extra stuff that comes from smoke. This isn't about judgment, it's about information. If you want to learn more, go to pax.com/science. PAX is setting higher standards so you can smoke less smoke. And for Planted listeners, get 20% off at pax.com with code PLANTED20.
100%. I'd actually like to bring this back to like something that Laura and I worked on like 8+ years ago, which is SB 34. This is a good example of how there was a change. Basically, quick background is that, as we talked about, like donation and compassionate care infrastructure was very big. And then it was somewhat lost during the passage of Prop 64. But there was companies such as PAX, led by Laura, and like being able to really focus on changing the current law to build out that infrastructure that was really important for us to really be able to stick to the values of what this business was built off of. And it wasn't just big businesses. It was also a lot of small localized companies, especially from up north, Humboldt, who were like, we have this infrastructure where we always want to make sure that a part of our crop goes towards cancer patients or low-income patients or veterans. And so it was very important for us to be able to build out that infrastructure. And we reiterated that with SB 25555 a couple months ago or a couple of years ago.
Yep.
And I think that was a really important way of like looking at like what was the old infrastructure, the old way of thinking, and then rebuilding it into what this new infrastructure that we're putting together. And it did take the effort of like large and small companies to make it happen. And so I do think that's a great example of how like we can come together as an industry to still push forward like the shared values that we really find important.
That's it. And it's all those resources make such a huge difference, all those voices. And Laura, as somebody who's coming from a company that's been very impactful in the industry, and as a leader in the industry that is, you've put your money where your mouth is, supporting the greater good. What are some of the learnings that you've had, and things that, when you've been teaching by example, that you feel are really important for people to know?
Yeah, I mean, I feel, and Ishaq mentioned this earlier, but we're to borrow kind of from the saying of building the plane in flight, like we have an opportunity here that most industries don't get. And that is to build a different kind of business. And I do believe that profit and purpose can sit next to each other, and that if we are really intentional about how we create this thing, we can not only, create successful economic outcomes, but strengthen our communities at the same time. And we're in this very interesting moment that I do think is a little bit precarious, where, one thing that goes wrong can really upset the entire apple cart, which means that we have to be thinking about every step and how we're sustainably bringing everyone along together. And I think, we've talked a little bit about the genesis of the movement, but, the war on drugs incarcerated whole communities that are still healing from, the collateral consequences of that. And, we are looking at patients, we are looking at environmental impacts of, how cultivation has taken place in some communities. And I think there's so much work to be done to ensure that, with all of the industry growth, and I think I just read 50 plus million Americans consumed cannabis this past year. Like, that's significant. Like, we are really moving in a direction where normalization is starting to happen at a faster clip, but all of that progress is irrelevant if we don't, have a strong foundation underneath us. And that requires us to make decisions every day that are about doing the right thing, and about, making decisions that maybe aren't always the fastest decision or the easiest decision or the most profitable decision, but the one that'll really set us up for success in the long run. And so, hopefully more companies are starting to think that way.
Well, so that dovetails into my next question. What does excellence in California cannabis look like today?
I mean, I think you could answer that question from a lot of different perspectives.
Totally.
So, I'll take mine. I think, for me, it's brands that are operating in a, ethical way that prioritizes the greater good. I think it's products that put consumers at the heart of what they're delivering. And I think it's folks that are building sustainable businesses that, whether they're companies or family businesses that are hopefully becoming economically viable and will be able to withstand all of the consolidation and just evolution of this industry that, is already happening and that we're going to continue to face.
I think a lot of the excellence that we built was in like a very relatively small scale back when it was illegal. And I think part of the excellence and the legacy of excellence is, how do we scale that up? How do we scale the environmental consciousness, the care for the plant, the care for the patient, all of that? And it's been challenging. I mean, we've seen it over the last 10 years. It's not always easy. But people that are willing to make that commitment in many cases do succeed. I mean, when I think about excellence, I think about the first time I went to Humboldt and I was visiting growers that have been doing this for generations, and they're rearing the worms for this live soil that they then use to then grow the plants, never using pesticides, never using any outside intervention. And so when I think about excellence and what that looks like, it is building out infrastructures like ECCO certification, which we've built out to help build out an infrastructure of transparency and care for people who are trying to provide, cannabis products to patients and customers. And the way that we've done that is really almost codifying a sort of past infrastructure or thought process about how we grow our plants, which is saying no outside intervention. We don't want pesticides. We want to make sure it's the most natural product possible. And so we're starting to see this infrastructure build out with things like ECCO certification, with OCal, with other sorts of standards that are helping elevate the products that we're putting out there. Because if we're really starting to look into the future and you think about just quote traditional CPG, if you want to end up on Whole Foods or on Costco shelves, you look at a packaging, there's 8 different certifications on there, whether it's fair trade, organic, all of these sorts of things. And so as we're building out this infrastructure, it takes organizations such as ECCO, companies such as PAX, who are willing to make that commitment to say, hey, we're trying to build out this very transparent, positive infrastructure to help ensure the excellence of what California has built and make sure we don't lose that as we scale up. Because that is my biggest fear.
And that's so important, because consumer trust is really all we have at the end of the day. And that's why quality is so important. And I think especially as you see the cannabis consumer mature, they expect more from, their products, and they expect to feel that they can be confident in not only the quality of the products, but the experiences. So really, really critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think, when we look at, we always have the naysayers, and some of them, their research is paid for by our cannabis tax money. So those of you listening out there know that some of your taxes actually go to work against you. Maybe you should talk to your legislators to let them know that you're not happy with that. But also, when we're looking at, people with compromised immune systems, that's one of the most sensitive things about making sure that we have clean, safe product. And as more people get involved in the industry, there are more people that are cutting corners that aren't coming with the heart and soul that a lot of our colleagues have, where they take it very seriously. Also, just kind of going back on like how cannabis can actually affect the rest of the world. When we look at a lot of our craft farmers that are looking at regenerative no-till farming practices, because the UN several years ago put out that report that we only had 50 more harvests in the world because of the way we were our monocropping and tilling was actually destroying the topsoil. So now those learnings go forth and inspire other people to help save the earth. I often wonder, if we hadn't had it made illegal in the 30s, what would we be looking at in our environment now if we had hemp to compete with plastics and lumber and all these things, because we were dealing with so many things. I mean, look, I was in London in June and it was sweltering. I mean, that's global warming. That's real. And I understand that the earth changes, because even before we were around, we were having the ice age and all of these other things. But as human beings, we have really sped things up, I think. And, we can do so much to change. I wanted to also, Laura, congratulate you and the PAX team on your silver medal this year for the Cannabis Awards.
Thank you. We are so excited. And the product that we received a silver medal for is actually an ECCO certified product. So particularly proud of that.
That's awesome.
That way you know that clean products win awards, and award-winning products are clean. So
that's right.
Keep an eye out for those.
Well said.
Well, and for our listeners, so that they can, I'm sure that they'd be curious in checking it out, which one of your products won the silver?
It was our GMO cookies PAX Trip all-in-one. It's also made with ocean-bound plastic and certified plastic negative, and available at dispensaries across the state.
I love. And
I do want to say that second part, the plastic negative part, is like another example of like how we can do something new and different. Like, we know that like in the cannabis space, like single-use vaporizers have become a big thing. So how do we mitigate? How do we do things better? What PAX is doing with like the making sure that ocean-bound plastic is now being used is a really important infrastructure that we're building. And I think that's part of like the sort of new age infrastructure that we're doing with what we're here in cannabis. And so definitely want to make sure to commend you guys for what you're doing with that and setting that example, because PAX is a big name. It sets the example for, I think, a lot of other companies. And importantly, it starts building out the actual manufacturing infrastructure to be able to do this and create those supply chains that we then eventually can build out and scale out. And so I think that like what we're doing with the plant goes beyond just the plant. Like it's a community full of very environmentally conscious and empathetic people. And I think there's a lot of creative ways that people are trying to like fit that into the way that we run our businesses as well.
Yeah. Yeah. If you care where your produce comes from, where your coffee comes from, you really should care where your cannabis is coming from. Ishaq, I had a question for you too. Like, what should consumers think about awards alongside research, or how should they think about awards alongside research, certification, and other indicators of quality? What do those signals tell us, and what can't they tell us?
One, I think more information is just always better. And I think one of the things that a lot of people are realizing is that like the same sativa doesn't affect everyone the same, or the same hybrid or indica. And so the more research that is out there, the more information that people have, whether it's, UC Berkeley sanctioned research, or it's even just like the infrastructure that we've developed with ECCO to have just more transparency for the products. Like when you're looking at a certificate of analysis with all the different chemical compounds that are in a plant, and you realize, oh, hey, this is what actually works for me. And you realize, oh, it's maybe this terpene profile, or it's this level of like CBD interaction with like THCV. Like there's all of these different ways that I think people are starting to really learn more about the plant. And I think one of the biggest deficits of prohibition was a lack of like proper scientific research, clinical research, environmental
100%.
research. And so I think it's really important for us to have this movement more towards research. I think that's one of the few things that we're getting out of this potential rescheduling with the federal government, a little bit, ideally, more research that's available. But the important thing is that it provides people with more information. Unfortunately, what it doesn't provide always is like the proper context for like how this information can be used. I think a lot of times, and what I've experienced just in my research, is that there's so much information that we don't know that we're almost shooting in the dark in what we're trying to develop. And in this most recent, like UC Berkeley Cannabis Research Center project I've been working on, it's opened up my mind to so many things that we don't realize. And I think that's also, you know, a net positive of doing this is like, we now know what else we need to learn. But I think the important thing that we need to understand and kind of reckon with is that we are decades and decades behind the research that is possible. Now, with that said, I want to make sure to like recognize that there's a lot of other countries like in South America, in Asia, in Europe that have done research. And so it doesn't not exist. It's now trying to figure out how do we properly like contextualize it and build it out into a context that is relevant to the United States and our legal system. And so I'm always a fan of research, always important to keep pushing for it because more information is just good. It's positive for the businesses, it's positive for the consumers, for patients, for policymakers, very importantly, because policymakers at the end of the day are the ones that are making these rules for us. And we want to make sure that they're as informed and as like prepared as possible to be able to handle what they're actually legislating.
Yeah, 100%. One of these days, we need to geek out on the decolonization of research methodologies. But that's a conversation for another day. That's a whole other episode.
But I'm in.
Yes. We will reconvene. So if somebody walks through the cannabis experience 10 years from now, what do you hope they'll see?
Hey guys, Hirsch Jane from Humboldt Family Farms here. And I gotta tell you about my dispensary run this week. It's my regular spot, right around the corner. There's a whole wall of flour, good prices, plenty to choose from. And there's not one sun-grown brand in the place. That bugs me. Sun-grown is how weed's been grown since forever. Out in the dirt, under the actual sun. Sun-grown cannabis cures slower, it builds terpenes, and it does it on rainwater and sunlight instead of a warehouse of grow lights and AC. But it's scarcer on shelves these days because stores chase price and THC numbers, and sun-grown gets squeezed out before you ever get to try it. That's why we started Humboldt Family Farms. We're a collective of independent family farms up in Humboldt who've worked the same ground for decades, and we get their sun-grown flower onto shelves with their name still on. So ask your shop for what they've got that's sun-grown. If the answer is nothing, you already know what to ask for.
I mean, I think for me, I really hope California goes on to continue to lead. And, you know, I've told you guys this story before, but I'm a, multi-generational Californian. My family came here during the gold rush. I bleed California, in my bones. I feel a very deep connection to what this state has brought to the world. And a couple years ago or earlier in my career, I was, at a dinner in Atlanta, and I remembered sitting at this really hip, fun restaurant, and the sommelier was pitching the table on Sonoma wines. And I had this aha moment because to me, that was so normal. I've, spent so much time in Sonoma. My family's there. And I was so surprised that to others outside of the state, it was so compelling. I mean, I think I always knew it was special, but I didn't really realize quite how special. And when you look at California cannabis today, we're not only the fourth largest economy in the world, we're the largest cannabis economy in the world. And we are doing so many things. The craft producers we have, the innovative extraction methods, there's just so much goodness and juiciness and excellence that is delivering these world-class products. And it's so cool to see the California State Fair create space for that conversation. And I just hope that this industry within California really goes on to represent globally what so many of our other kind of exports mean to the world. I think there's a really exciting opportunity there, and I really hope to see us realize it.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of that, like I want to see the California cannabis experience become even more front and center in something like the state fair, because I come from the Central Valley. It's an ag region. These state fairs are about celebrating our agricultural history, yet we don't consider cannabis as part of that. Yet when you look at the actual numbers, if we actually considered cannabis to be an agricultural product, it would be our largest agricultural export by a huge margin in California. And if we were to actually sort of like scale that out, or like, you know, do like a comparison with all the other agriculture there, cannabis would be the largest experience there. And I don't mean just like a place for people to just smoke and consume. I'm talking about, this is a place where we can have, you know, the mock greenhouse up. You can have like the way that like you have all the farm animals out in display, like having different cultivars and different ways of like growing different soil contents. Like I want to like, and this is me just being my cannabis nerd, my weed nerd coming out, being like, I want to see every part of how this thing is grown, from like the curing tents to like the trim, like however they do these things. And so
just not behind its own gate.
Exactly. And that's the important part. Like right now we are behind our own gate, and for what it's worth, it works. We're making it work. But I do want to see it I want us to stop being treated like the problem child that needs to be relegated off. Like put them in the old water park. Like they can go smoke over there. They'll be fine. Don't get me wrong. We make it the best party and the best event at the state fair.
Absolutely.
But I think being able to help destigmatize more by not having to be behind an age gate and a locked gate or whatever it is, like being able to now be front and center is what I see in the future. Because I think more and more people are realizing that it's not, again, the capital D bad drugs that we're selling there. It's part of our California heritage. And so I think being able to integrate that into more of the actual event is what we're going to see in the future. Honestly.
Yeah. Because as we've seen year after year, you know, it went from kind of being something quietly along the side, let's see how this works, to sometimes it's the destination point for people at the fair now, which makes me so excited. I so love our conversations. I'm going to close out today with one final question for you both. What's one thing California cannabis should never forget?
Oh, that's a great question. I think for me, it all goes back to the roots and really what the promise of this plant is for the world and how much good can be done from it. Not just, you know, through cannabis products, but to your point, Sarah, through, you know, industrial usage and just everything that cannabis can represent to help make the world a better place. That sounds very idealistic and naive, but I, you know, am one of those people that truly believes this plant is magical and can have a profound impact on so many things. And I hope that we continue to advance that.
And I think we need to remember that like this shows that change is possible. That like, again, like after, you know, decades and decades of prohibition, that with people power, plant power and people power, we're able to make very significant change. And 30 years ago, that was massive. First ever, you know, cannabis legalization laws on the books. And where are we now? We're talking about like exporting to Europe, and there's like rescheduling conversations happening. Like change is possible. And I think that's one thing that people shouldn't forget, especially people that are in the industry who are getting bogged down with, in a lot of cases, like changes that are more challenging for them. But it sets the template and the inspiration that we can make bigger changes. We can do things. It just takes a little bit of organization and people power.
Yeah.
But it's possible.
Yeah. So we can do it when we work together.
Yeah. Hey, better together all the way. One of the things I love about hosting Planted is getting to speak with people who care not only about where this industry is today, but about what we're building for the future. And our greatest strength has never been one product, one company, or one moment. It's the people who care enough to keep asking how we can do better. So, Laura, Ishaq, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you for your perspectives and the work that you do. And for people who want to follow what you're doing on social media or learn more about your companies, how do they do that?
This episode is brought to you by Fat Nugs Magazine, a global perspective of cannabis and stoner culture as a bridge to the rest of the world. Right now, you can join Fat Nugs Magazine, Beard Bros Farms, Freedom Grow, and Jailed for Weed in the upcoming Prisoners Edition and help spotlight current and past cannabis prisoners and their stories, because no one should be in jail for a plant. Find Fat Nugs Magazine's beautiful print copies at your local dispensary, fatnugsmag.com, and on socials. Cannabis culture welcomes us all.
You can find PAX at PAX_official.
You can find ECCO at ECCO, ECCO _CERT, CERT, or at our ecocert.org as well for our website. You can see all of our certified products, all of our certified brands, and all the action that we're doing out there.
Awesome. Thank you both so much. I love having you on the show. I'm excited about having some more conversations about research methodologies. Thank you, my friends. Until next time. And everyone, remember, if you like listening, please give us a review, share it with a friend. Let us know what your favorite episodes are. And if you'd like to stay in touch over social media, we are Planted with Sara Pion on Facebook and Planted with Sara on Instagram and Twitter. You can also go to our website, www.plantedwithsara.com, or listen to us on our parent network, Radio Misfits Network, where there are other great podcasts, like one of my favorites, the Winemakers Podcast. So check it out. You can listen to Planted wherever you listen to your favorite podcast, whether that's Pandora, Spotify, Amazon, Google, Apple, Stitcher, Tune in. We are there. So join us. And until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, it's a wild world out there. Be good to one another. Until next time, take care.